And thank you all for being here today. I know it's lunchtime. You didn't have to be here. You could have been somewhere else. So I'm glad to see you here with me. Okay. My paper is entitled Portrait of an Invented Lady. And you'll see as I go through the research that I've done and the conclusions that I've made, why I've chosen that title. This is the title of the third chapter of my dissertation, so this represents just a microcosm of that work, but it's on this topic of respectability that I hinge my belief as to why I think that massive resistance happened at Central High School in 1957. I think that it's something much deeper than race alone. I think it's intimately tied to a certain class of black women who decided that they had been the backbone of Little Rock for generations, and that Brown versus Board of Education had given them a prime opportunity to assert social activism that had existed for decades inside of their communities, and to use the clout and the class standing that they had within that community to present themselves and assert that they weren't working twice as hard to be considered half as good. They were exactly equal to anybody inside of Central High. And with that, I shall begin. Exhaustion emanates from the dirt where Jim Crow defined every facet of life in Huttig, Arkansas. A once thriving timber industry is all but defunct. Years of oil drilling in the southern part of the state have irrevocably scarred that landscape. Huttig's physical scars mirror its psychological wound, that is, its turbulent relationship between black and white locals. As recently as 2011, the town's first black mayor endured harassment and terrorism from white citizens. In that sense, Daisy Bates might recognize the remnants of the community into which she was born and about which she stated were painful to write. Her memoir, The Long Shadow of Little Rock, records that Main Street divided cordial Huttig into two communities, quote, White Town and Negra Town, end quote. Yet as a child, she did not fully understand the social implications of being black until she tried to order meat in a public market and endured racial slurs from white adults. Her recollection is unremarkable considering that all black Southerners in the early decades of the 20th century had double consciousness thrust upon them in childhood. Her story resonates, however, because she became one of the most famous figures of the American Civil Rights Movement, and this terrible memory seared into her mind that she deserved to be respected as a lady. Daisy Bates noted that she was 7 years old the first time she experienced the raw racism of Jim Crow. Her precise birth date is shrouded in mystery, however, as is much of her early life in Huttig. In a 1955 police investigation, Bates's husband stated that she was born on November 11, 1914, yet if her recollection of her age when she visited the butcher shop is accurate, she's at least 1 year older than that was filed by the Arkansas State Police. Daisy Lee Gatson appears in the town census records for the first time in 1920. If her estimation of her age is correct in her memoir, that is the year that Daisy Bates, née Gatson, walked into the market and officially entered public blackness. Census records list her as the foster child of Susie and Orly Smith, who reared her until she was an older teenager and whom she referenced all of her life as her family. No birth certificate exists for Bates. A delayed certificate was issued by the Arkansas State Board of Health on August 10, 1962, at the height of her fame as a civil rights activist, and claims that her parents were John Gatson and Millie Riley. The release of such a document just before the unveiling of her memoir in September of 1962 reveals Bates's raw, self-educated understanding of public relations and marketing. Her birth certificate also highlights a preoccupation with the respectability standards that defined middle-class standing in the black community. Though the certificate did not list Gatson and Riley as married, being able to cite her birth parents while still referencing the Smiths as guardians who instilled in her the tenets of hard work and racial dignity allowed Bates a point of origin that mitigated awkward truths in her personal history over which social conventions of the time labeled her illegitimate. Sensitivity to the social meanings that surrounded her birth may have led Bates to craft more than one story to explain her early circumstances. In her autobiography, Bates recounted Orly Smith revealed that her biological mother had been brutally raped and murdered by 3 white men in Huttig. While this story is entirely plausible in the context of black women's sexual exploitation in the South, the horrific death of Ms. Riley is a point of contention and controversy. Historian Griff Stockley notes that the now defunct Huttig News does not corroborate Riley's murder in the era in which she would have died. It is possible that Minnie Harris, another black woman whose killing was confirmed by newspapers, is actually Bates's mother. However, the existence and community acknowledgement of Ms. Harris renders unlikely that she gave birth to a daughter who would not have known her name, or whose name would not have been recounted in recollections of the Smith family's remembrances about Daisy Bates's lineage. As the report of Harris's death also highlights, it is doubtful that the murder of Mrs. Riley would have been ignored. Historian Crystal Feimster has proven that black women's deaths were published in white newspapers even when they did not engender sympathy from those audiences. For certain, black-owned newspapers in Arkansas covered instances of rape and sexual assault as the crimes that they were, and as matters of principle to highlight abuses of the black community by white society. That Millie Riley's murder would have gone entirely unsubstantiated is improbable. The missing information is even more suspect as Daisy remembered her mother and her personality. Described as very pretty, with dark brown skin and long black hair, Minnie Riley was attractive enough to merit frightening attention. Orly Smith added that Riley was, quote, not the kind to submit, so they took her, end quote. Bates's memory of this moment underscores black women's historic resistance to white men's abuses and highlights Riley's tenacity, bravery, and self-respect that became Daisy's birthright, that she put to brilliant display as an adult. Nevertheless, the woman painted in this portrait was not the sort to quietly disappear. Indeed, childhood friends of Bates's recounted that Huttig's black and white communities took note when Riley vanished. The provocative possibility remains that Bates, the activist, may have fabricated the grisly story of her biological mother's death to elicit sympathy from white audiences, and black alike, the former of whom could be potentially galvanized to social action, and the latter of whom intimately knew the reality of white men's sexual and violent impulses. Surviving relatives believe that Daisy, quote, didn't know who her people were, end quote. Another hint that she may have fabricated the story of how her birth mother died. In an interview with a Durham, North Carolina newspaper, Bates offered a seemingly innocuous statement about her memoir that is tantalizing 54 years removed. Quote, I tried to take in the whole scope of the struggle in this country at that time, end quote. Perhaps she only did mean that in writing her experiences, she worked to convey a sense of the enormity of what Little Rock came to mean in the context of civil rights. Yet if her childhood recollections are even marginally accurate and not misremembered through the prisms of pragmatism and time, Bates understood the intersectional challenges to black womanhood when little white girls played in relative innocence to the profundity of Jim Crow and to race, sex, and class. How black women navigated social spaces certainly constituted part of Daisy's whole scope of the struggle, even as those highly specific engagements were incorporated into black men's experiences or they were ignored altogether. Therefore, the veracity of Bates's claims about her personal history matter less than the significance of the sudden documentation of her birth and her explanation for her mother's absence in her life. What is incontrovertible is that nothing at the beginning of her life marked Daisy Gatson Bates as, quote, respectable. Regardless of whether her biological mother died for being, quote, considered the rightful prey of white gentlemen of the South, protected neither by public sentiment nor law, end quote. Bates was certainly the daughter of an unmarried woman in an era of unmitigated racism and classism. Club women in particular were desperate to eradicate the pervading images of licentious black women and sought to police working class and poor black women's behavior to achieve that end. As a light-skinned child, her appearance potentially complicated Bates's social standing in Huttig even further. During the most volatile days of the Little Rock crisis, hate mail that Bates received questioned her race, as one writer stated, quote, "Anyone can see that you have white blood in your veins, and no doubt the whites snub you," end quote. If that and the story of her mother's rape are accurate, Bates lived as an uncomfortable reminder of white men's sexual hypocrisy in a town of fewer than 230 citizens of any color. Even more difficult, she shared a roof with the Smiths, whom she loved but who never gave her their name, and from whom Bates always differentiated herself by describing her family as her adopted mother, father, and kin. Finally, Daisy Lee Gatson was born an illegitimate female. Misogynoir, the combination of racism and sexism, victimized females with Jim Crow racism and sexism, and was further complicated by the historical stereotypes that served to define, quote, virtuous whiteness from degraded blackness, end quote, that complicated infant girls' first breaths. In the foreword of Bates's memoir, Eleanor Roosevelt mused that black women bore a double burden, wherein they were not only considered members of an inferior race, but as the inferior sex of that race. And as an adult in the public spotlight, Bates implicitly understood the importance of controlling her personal narrative to avoid those ends. Her preoccupation with respectability and transcending Jim Crow definitely began in childhood, instilled by the examples of her foster parents as much as her initiation to racism. Orly Smith contributed financial support to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, headquartered in New York. NAACP members also presented or strived to present themselves as standard bearers for black middle-class respectability. Throughout her life, Bates insisted that her foster father reared her to be a lady, and in funding the nation's most prolific racial justice society, Orly Smith affirmed his family's status as the better sort who emulated uplift and worked towards the advancement of black people. However, in most aspects, Mother oversaw the instruction of her foster daughter. Susie Smith provided religious guidance and social dictates that solidified the Smiths' reputation within Huttig's black community as a decent Christian family. Other markers, including Orly Smith's job as a mill worker, indicated their middle-class status among their friends and neighbors. Susie Smith did not have to work outside the home or in the employment of white people. As neither she nor her husband boasted the education or the skills that made such an arrangement more common for black families, that privilege serves as a poignant status marker that Bates internalized as a symbol of womanhood and propriety. Susie Smith behaved like a lady. Sternly devout and dignified, her fanatical preoccupation with cleanliness and personal neatness encompassed her home and herself and her church and young Daisy Lee Gatson. Emulating the ethos of the woman's era of the early 20th century, Smith and other black women strived for impeccable surfaces that mirrored intangible chastity, temperance, and refinement. Cleanliness created an armor against and defied the white gaze that attempted to dismiss black women as ladylike. Susie Smith also resolutely discouraged her foster daughter from games and behaviors that evangelical Christians deemed immoral and therefore disreputable. Irritated by her husband's fondness for Saturday night gambling, but outraged when Daisy emulated her foster father's habit by playing for keeps marbles, Smith once yelled, quote, "You see what you're doing to your daughter?" End quote. In a single outburst, her anger reveals the complexity of black womanhood that Bates intrinsically recognized as a child and that she carried into adulthood and activism. As a Southern evangelical Christian, Susie Smith admonished gambling not only to preserve the souls of her family, But in the context of blackness, she used the mantle of her faith to protect them from stereotypes of depravity that made black Southerners especially vulnerable to white policing and to white terrorism. Layered within that shield were Smith's attempts to guard her foster daughter from stereotypes of licentiousness and impropriety that haunted black women and made them vulnerable to white sexual violence. If Bates embellished the story of her biological mother's death, Susie Smith understood the perils that mere existence presented to black women and shamed her husband for skirting the respectability standards that might protect their foster daughter while simultaneously disproving white beliefs about black womanhood. Bates's remembrances offer an interesting window into a personal family dynamic and to intersectionality within black gender roles. Bates recounted Orly Smith as a gentle, fun, and loving father all of her life. Her affection for him shined, whereas her respect for Susie Smith originated from her foster mother's more severe personality. Susie's natural seriousness was almost certainly intensified by the boundaries placed on respectable womanhood that were confounded by race. Mother's example demanded irreproachable image that Bates valued as an adult and effectively employed during the integration crisis at Central High School. As she internalized the tenets of respectable black womanhood, Bates also discerned the possibility of her own femininity. Portraits and photographs taken in Bates's adulthood showcase her legacy from her birth mother. Wide, dark eyes framed by long black lashes and overset with a heavy brow shined from a round, soft face whose apple cheeks and bowed lips could reveal a perfect smile, all under a halo of gleaming black curls. Candid images of the middle-aged Bates during the most terrible and exhausting days of the Little Rock crisis still captured a luminous beauty that in her youth must have excited and terrified her because of the potential to attract unwanted attention from men or resentment from women. In addition to her looks, Bates's formidable personality struck anyone who interacted with her. Gloucester B. Current, national director of the NAACP, who worked with Bates from her earliest involvement with the organization in Little Rock in the 1940s, was impressed by her aggressiveness and her charm. Vivacious, charismatic, and fun-loving, Bates attracted friends from the time she was a little girl in Huttig. She was also imbued with a confidence and an iron will that empowered her to assertion. In retelling her account of Millie Riley's death, Bates recalled her despondency when she learned what happened to her mother, and subsequent hatred for white people that culminated in slapping a white playmate. It's not difficult to imagine that a sad, enraged child would act out in that way or why she would do that. It is certain that Daisy Lee Gatson knew the potentially dangerous consequences for a young black girl who hit a young white girl in the Jim Crow South. If the incident occurred as Bates remembers, her actions underscored a self-assurance that enabled her to stand up when she believed she and others were wronged, and exercise that facet of her personality as a form of respectable black womanhood that refused to be denigrated by white supremacy. The story also tacitly shows a recklessness within Bates that threatened the propriety that the Smiths tried to instill in their orphaned and illegitimate ward. Daisy Lee Gatson met Lucius Christopher Bates, L.C. Bates, in 1928 when he sold an insurance policy to Orly Smith. The 24-year-old traveling salesman struck up a friendship with Smith that allowed him to visit the family and their 15-year-old foster daughter for 3 years. In an interview with Ebony in 1958, L.C. remembered his then-wife as, quote, nothing but a kid who looked a little better when she got a little older, end quote. In fact, Elsie immediately noticed Daisy. Radiantly beautiful and magnetic with all the energy of a teenage girl, it was probably as impossible to ignore her in the family's modest home as it was later impossible to ignore her presence in the nation's most elite political circles. Daisy Lee Gatson found L.C. Bates equally fascinating. Tall, gangly, and bespectacled, Bates was not conventionally handsome, but he was uniquely advantaged amongst black Southern men. Unlike millions of men his age, Bates never, quote, picked or chopped cotton, end quote. Born in Mississippi to Morris and Laura Bates, a Baptist preacher and a homemaker, respectively, L.C. was reared in a middle-class black household that spared him the difficult life of a sharecropper. Instead, he pursued writing while attending high school at Alcorn College before leaving the state to attend Wilberforce University, where his father paid his tuition. In Ohio, the chaotic Bates decided to, quote, break his father's heart by leaving school to chase a print career. As a reporter, Bates wrote assiduously to attack Jim Crow. He fought injustice by withholding his patronage from segregated businesses and wielding his fierce intellect that whites pretended did not exist in black people. L.C. Bates presented himself as a passionate man who refused to yield and who excited black people with his confidence and his tenacity. Everything about his carriage and personality attracted young Daisy Lee Gatson. Yet, if the adult Bates understood the power of enhancing the past, she also recognized the rationality in cloaking it. Her brief memoir references to the beginning of their relationship, and it is meant to hide the uncomfortable reality that when she met L.C. Bates, he had been married for 6 years. In April 1922, L.C. Bates married Cassandra Crawford in Council Bluff, Iowa. The first Mrs. Bates maintained the Memphis home that she occasionally shared with her traveling husband, who for a time elected to work in sales as a more stable economic alternative to writing. There, Cassandra reared Oscar Flakes, her son from a previous marriage, and Loretta Ann Bunn. In later years, Bunn asserted that Cassandra and L.C. reared her from infancy but never formally adopted her, a claim that her foster mother corroborated. Assuming the veracity of Bunn's family history, L.C. pursued Daisy while a wife and 2 children waited for him to come home. Bates insisted throughout her life that she married L.C. only after Orly Smith died, yet surviving family members state that she actually left home with the married man before her foster father passed away. Daisy's dalliance with a married man directly contradicted the strict adherence to sexual morality that separated the better sort of black ladies from, quote, common women, and ostracized her from the middle-class black respectability that defined the Smiths' home. On a personal level, Susie Smith must have felt betrayed by L.C. Bates and may even have believed that she and her late husband were duped in a con by a sexual predator. Through Daisy's eyes, L.C. almost certainly represented the most exciting chance she had ever been offered. Black propriety and white supremacy be damned. If Bates ever felt that she could have been entirely candid with anyone in her adulthood, she may even have admitted that the corset of respectability politics had threatened to suffocate her. L.C. far more resembled the kind of thinker who might have thrived in Harlem than the upright people to whom he was born and who reared Daisy. For his part, he appeared to be genuinely in love with her for the rest of his life, and probably struggled to reconcile that love against social and personal circumstances. Smith's grief and anger are as understandable as the romantic impulses of a young girl from a simultaneously dull and violent Milltown, and as a young man frustrated by the unyielding confines of Jim Crow. Daisy Lee Gatson left Huttig in 1930 to live with L.C. Bates as his mistress in Memphis for the next 12 years. For more than a decade, neither party felt any need to adhere to the demands of respectable middle-class blackness that would have included a divorce, another marriage, and a distinct mea culpa to anyone or anybody in the community that they had offended with their relationship. It is fair to argue that L.C. and Daisy only cared about perceived propriety or social mores once they decided to relocate to Little Rock and start a newspaper. At 30 years old, Daisy could not have lived as a wide-eyed ingenue in thrall to a married older man who dreamed that his newspaper would fight Jim Crow and highlight the worth of the black community. To that pragmatic end, Elsie decided to divorce Cassandra Crawford in 1941 or 1942 and definitely married Daisy on March 4th, 1942 in Fordyce, Arkansas. The newlyweds celebrated their marriage by purchasing the Twin City Press and rechristening it as the Arkansas State Press that would become the most widely read black-owned newspaper in the state. What must marriage have signified to Daisy Bates as an adult woman? It's easy enough to draw conclusions as to what her relationship meant when she was an 18-year-old. Over the next 10 years, though, Daisy Lee Gatson moved through Memphis without the pressures of respectability politics, except for those she may have grappled with internally. No work record exists for her in the 1930s. By all available accounts, she enjoyed being a mistress in the fullest sense of what that title means. Elsie supported her in a second home where she lived full-time, paid for her living expenses, and provided her an allowance that enabled her to shop, patronize beauty parlors, and indulge her hobbies. This is particularly remarkable because Elsie Bates could afford 2 households in Depression, Tennessee, during a time when most Southerners of any color or class struggled to keep body and soul together in one home. It is a side project to figure out how good of a salesman he was. Most important, though, is that the overwhelming majority of black Southern women at that time worked in low-paying domestic jobs of varying dubious conditions for white households. It is valid and necessary to remember that Elsie funded Daisy's existence during this period, but it's a mistake to not consider how she internalized having economic security and freedom of movement in a major urban area without the legal and personal confines of being someone's wife. During the periods when Elsie was working or was with Cassandra, Daisy alone controlled the terms of where she chose to go, irrespective of patriarchal authority or black respectability. She could not have helped but notice her strange kind of privilege, and the general anonymity must have been exhilarating. For a person as independent and naturally willful, Daisy had to have appreciated at least some parts of her bohemian relationship and life, and she surely thought about Jim Crow restrictions entirely from the perspective of a publicly single black woman. How did her experiences in Memphis shape her lifelong resentment of white supremacy, or refine her emerging political ideas in those years? It's impossible to estimate the breadth of her formal education that might have influenced her thinking. In a 1976 interview with Elizabeth Jackaway, Daisy insisted that she graduated from high school, but other evidence suggests that her education actually stopped at the elementary level. Regardless, though, it's fair to argue that Daisy's real intellectual and political education began in Memphis, long one of the most celebrated urban areas of the South. A country girl from South Arkansas must have been excited and infuriated by the paradox of freedom and restriction that she found there. There, she had the money and the time to shop, but only from black-owned stores, or suffer humiliation of ordering clothes from white-owned shops where she was not allowed on the sales floor. At beauty parlors, she paid to have her hair fixed and her nails done, while listening to other black women who spanned the gamut of professionals to domestics, discussing the hazards of working in segregationist Memphis. Daisy took pride in her beauty as a matter of personal and later political business. Friends commented that, quote, everything about her was right. Her hair, her nails, her clothes, it was all right, end quote. Frequent trips to the beauty parlor undoubtedly educated Daisy in grassroots activism, political ideology, and all class levels of individual black women's experiences, navigating and resisting oppression, while stylists permed her hair and manicured her hands. Daisy's time in Memphis, where she had the means and the ability to move in the world without the social pressures of community, kin, and marriage, enabled her as she grew into adulthood to acutely understand the profound intersectional barriers placed upon black women of all statuses. Ironically, she analyzed them from a position of relative freedom as a married man's mistress. When she married Elsie in 1942, Each of them recognized the political reasons why they made their relationship legitimate. Yet it is fairly impossible to imagine that Daisy did not quietly mourn the autonomy that she lost in that process, or resent that she had to put on the trappings of middle-class respectability, even when she clearly believed that wearing those mantles were the best ways for Black women to successfully fight Jim Crow in actual courts and in the courts of public opinion. Quote, "This paper stands for honesty, justice, and fair play, and it stands behind what it stands for," end quote, was the inaugural headline of the Arkansas State Press. The press also offered constant allusions to Black respectability that earned the approval of middle-class and elite Black Little Rock, and especially emphasized Black womanhood that exalted the kinds of middle-class standards that Daisy strived to emulate as LC's wife. Co-eds, prodigious talents, fiancés, professionals, brides-to-be, and the wives of respected and influential men glowed within the publication that acknowledged that woman's parents, her education, and her accomplishments, that underlined all of these women as ladies. This directly contradicted the racially stratified city that pretended no Black female, regardless of her class, could embody the title of lady. Showcasing Black women in these contexts not only battled prejudice, but also solidified Daisy Bates as an immensely respectable woman who assisted her husband in exposing injustice. Her cheerful, energetic personality drew her in the new community and belied an emerging social and political maturity that probably began forming in Memphis. And it fed off of her inherent resentment of white supremacy and her own insecurity of her personal history. In marrying LC, Daisy admitted that she understood their indiscretions would hurt them politically and personally. At the State Press, she actively worked to rewrite her own narrative from that of a modestly educated, romantic teenage seductress to a hardworking, respectable, married lady. Her growing attention to community issues under mentorship from her husband helped to polish her own sense of how Black womanhood should be represented to the whole of Little Rock as she shored up her bona fides as Mrs. Bates. Through her life, she refashioned herself into a role that the most respectable, middle-class, and elite Black women had powerfully wielded since Reconstruction, the role of clubwoman. Bates joined a litany of activist organizations, including the Committee on Negro Organizations, the Urban League of Greater Little Rock, the Arkansas Council of Human Relations, and the Young Women's Christian Organization. She was busy. Her visibility through the newspaper, combined with her deepening role in social justice issues within the capital city, buttressed her self-confidence and gained the respect of fellow activists in the state chapter of the NAACP, who elected Bates as their president in 1952. Black Little Rock recognized her as a conscientious crusader who had been reared, above all, to be a lady. In a Jim Crow context, femininity and the contested term, lady, existed in white minds as everything that Black womanhood could not be. Daisy Bates reclaimed that title for herself and for all of the middle-class Black women of her community by presenting herself as respectable beyond reproach, in addition to her charisma, her good looks, and her devilish work ethic. Her reinvention from orphaned ward and teenage siren into a lady would make the difference in participation, perception, sympathy, and backlash as she used her role to continue challenging Jim Crow in Little Rock and to confront white supremacy in the contentious realm of school integration. Thank you.